Hello, everybody, and welcome to my review of A Quiet Place Part 2. In case you haven't noticed, I'm not in my studio. It's been a bit of an odyssey with this movie. I was supposed to go see it, drive a few hours away from where I live to see it earlier this week, and wasn't able to do that for various different reasons. So I went and saw it tonight. I'm filming this late Thursday night as the movie has opened. I am on the road at a location that you will probably learn later on. So I have to take the gear, go on the road. This is not an adult film. This is, in fact, my review for A Quiet Place Part 2. I figured, you know what? I've reviewed movies from the closet of my bedroom at my mom's house and different iterations of studios and apartments and houses. Why not a hotel as well? Let's just scratch another one off the list. My opinion remains the same, and the movie remains the same, and that is A Quiet Place Part 2, which was one of the first movie delays of the pandemic last year. This movie had already had a premiere, it had already had a junket, it was mere days from being released, and yet here we are over a year later going into Memorial Day weekend. And the good news, especially if you like the first movie, is that this was worth the wait. A lot of people, I think, are going to be returning to theaters maybe for the first time in a year to see this film. It does not disappoint. And a big reason why it's not a disappointment is that most of the key figures have returned. You have writer-director John Krasinski back in the director's chair. You also have Emily Blunt reprising her role as Evelyn Abbott. And you also have Millicent Simmons and Noah Jupe reprising their roles as the kids in the family. And when we're talking about a sequel, I guess you have to categorize this as sort of a prequel sequel, because this isn't any secret. The trailers have shown this very heavily, but we start the movie with a day one prologue, which allows you to see sort of the very beginnings of the invasion of these mysterious creatures. It also allows John Krasinski to come back in front of the camera for a little bit. It's not a huge part of the movie. It's not like a Godfather 2 half and half type thing, but I thought it was a really interesting way to start the film because there are so many questions, and this movie doesn't go into the deep origins. It doesn't make that mistake, and I'm glad it doesn't. There's actually a few mistakes that sequels often make that this movie doesn't make. One of them is over-explanation of what these creatures are. That is a good move. Following the prologue, we pick up literally exactly where A Quiet Place left off, and the few seconds that have passed have really matured the Abbott children. I mean, this is something that you just have to deal with. You're going to have to, it's going to be a suspension of disbelief thing with Millicent Simmons and Noah Jupe. The fact that a couple years have passed since the last movie, yeah, they grew up, and this is a continuous action thing. You just have to kind of wave your hand and go on, because the only other option would be extensive CGI or recasting, and I don't think either one of those are the solutions to this particular issue. It's just one of the hazards of working with young actors. However, the good news is that both Noah Jupe and Millicent Simmons are fantastic young actors, and they both have their parts to play in this movie. The first Quiet Place was very confined. This movie opens things up a little bit more, not just with the Abbotts going out into the world, but the story at one point fragments, and you have different characters going off on different things that they need to do. There is one story that I think is really given a preference, one story that really feels like the main thrust of the film, but the other characters don't get completely lost in the shuffle. And also a tip of the hat, not just to the writing team, but to the editing team, because these all could have seemed like, if you're just simply cutting back and forth, it could have seemed a little anticlimactic at points, because the stakes aren't necessarily the same in every situation, but it all kind of crescendos simultaneously as you get into the third act of the movie, and it does feel like each one of these stories has consequence, even though they don't necessarily connect to each other. So that is a great way, if you're looking at screenwriting and editing 101, of having characters that you can split up but still make it seem like each one of these stories is important. So many times in a sequel or in other movies, they split characters up and you feel like, well, this one doesn't really matter. I'm not really invested in this one. I was invested in every one of the stories that this movie was telling, and it didn't feel like a cheat that you didn't see these characters together for the whole time, especially because the first movie was about how close this family unit was. Emily Blunt may get top billing, and she deserves it, but this is really in many ways Millicent Simmons' movie. Her character takes on the monumental task of carrying on her father's work, of figuring out ways to repel these creatures, and when an opportunity presents itself to make a big leap forward in that development, we really do get to see the growth of her character, not just the fact that she has grown as an actress, both in talent and the fact that they've aged a couple years since the first film, but the character herself experiences growth, and you see the mistakes that come from that. You see the empowerment that comes from that. There are so many different things that we see this character kind of coming into her own place in the world, and in many ways, that's also what this movie is about. It's about finding your place in the world, and that's whether literally the family trying to find a new place in the world, or the kids in the family coming into their own, realizing that they are going to have to be a custodial generation. They're going to have to take care of themselves and take care of others. There are several moments of high tension. I will say none of them really rivaled anything that was in that first movie. There were so many great things because that was such a different film, and because this was our first time with these characters, it's hard to go head to head or toe to toe with those sequences. And I think that John Krasinski understands that, because he doesn't try to replicate what he did with the first A Quiet Place. You're never going to be able to replicate the surprise of that movie. He instead decides to evolve. As I mentioned before, there are a lot of mistakes that sequels make that this movie doesn't make. One of them is over-explaining what's going on. The other one is that it doesn't go too big. It would have felt like more of the same if they just stayed on the farm and you would have had another invasion or intrusion from these creatures. So you do have to expand the world and going out into the world, and it does feel bigger. You have more characters, you see more of the world, but it doesn't go too big. You don't feel like you've lost the thread of why you love this movie and why you love these characters in the first place. And that happens so many times in sequels, where you have a movie that's original and that people love, and then you blow it up so much in the second film that people forget why they liked the first film, or you lose that heart, you lose the originality. Everything is intact here. It is a really, really good job of taking these characters that we know and love and bringing them into the world without losing what we loved about them from the first film. I don't want to go too far into the plot, because there are things that happen that are probably going to be a surprise for a lot of people. The trailers have actually done a pretty good job of setting up the premise of the movie without giving away all the surprises of the movie. Suffice it to say that it does leave you wanting more in a similar way that the first one left you wanting more, although this ending doesn't seem quite as natural as the ending of the first film. Now, this is going to be probably a good thing or a bad thing for some people. I think maybe the movie might end and some people might go, what, that's it? Because there does seem to be more story to tell. That's probably good for Paramount, because you can either end it with this film, and it does end in a place where it doesn't feel like a cheat. There's a natural progression where you can take things in your head and you can understand where the story is likely going to go, but it is also very open to where a third Quiet Place film might go. And I honestly think it's very likely that there's going to be a third Quiet Place film. I don't necessarily hate that idea, only because Krasinski really has proven here that he can take the story and these characters and evolve them once. And if he can do it once, I have faith in him that he can do it a second time. I'm sure a lot of that is going to be at the box office. How does it do at the box office? With Paramount Plus, it's going to have an abbreviated theatrical window of 45 days. It's all numbers that we're not really going to see. But a lot of times when a movie like this ends and it seems like an obvious setup for a sequel, I'll kind of roll my eyes and go like, oh, great. So this was just a setup for another one. I didn't feel like that at the end of this film. I do feel like the plot threads and the story threads in this movie are drawn to a close, but I also feel like there are a lot of interesting places to go for a third film. So overall, this is a recommendation for me for A Quiet Place Part 2. If you liked the first one, I think you're really going to like this one as well. As I mentioned, it doesn't quite have that novelty of the first Quiet Place, and it doesn't quite hit the same high highs as far as the horror and the tension go, but I found it to be generally entertaining, still a very tense film, a very action-heavy film, maybe more action-heavy than the first one even. Great performances, especially from Millicent Simmons, but also from Noah Jupe, Cillian Murphy, and Emily Blunt, who really make up the core and the heart of the film, and an entry in a franchise that could be the end, but also leaves plenty of space to expand. What did you think of A Quiet Place Part 2? Is this going to be your first movie back in the theaters? Let me know down in the comments below. And as always, if you want to see even more of what I'm up to, you can check me out at patreon.com/Dan Murrell. These are some of my producer level patrons. They are the top tier over on Patreon. We do Schmodown study sessions every single month. But it's not just the producer level on Patreon. We also do things like movie commentaries that all patrons get, Schmodown commentaries, the monthly movie club, a watch along each and every month. Lots of really fun stuff, and I would love to have you come check us out over there. But first and foremost, I'd like to thank you for watching this video. As we get deeper into the summer movie season, I look forward to reviewing even more of these hotly anticipated films, not only from 2021, but from 2020 as well. We've got a lot to catch up on, and you can do it all right here on the channel. Thank you so much. Stay safe out there, and I'll see you next time.